Hey everyone, and welcome back to Rank and File Sports. And today we're going to be hopping right back into our series where we are predicting every single Power 4 team's record by the start of the college football season. And today's team is Oklahoma. They came in at number 18 in our preseason Rank and File poll. And Oklahoma is one of the hardest teams to project this year. They have a lot of talent and they were poised to make a potential jump in the Big 12. However, they switched conferences to the SEC, and it's really going to be a difficult test for Oklahoma. But it's also difficult to know how well they're going to do. They have a big range of win-loss records that they could have, probably anywhere from 6 to like 10 or 11, just really depending on how well they're able to adjust. The first three games of the season really won't be much of an issue for Oklahoma at all, with matchups at home against Temple, Houston, and Tulane. However, that first SEC matchup against Tennessee, even though it's at home, is going to be a pretty difficult game in my opinion. Both teams have the capabilities for a lot of offensive explosives, and this is going to be a very high scoring game in my opinion. Definitely one to watch out for Oklahoma. And then a potentially tricky road trip to Auburn. Auburn's ranked in the top 25 of some of the preseason polls that I've seen. I personally don't have them quite that high, but I do think Auburn's going to be a decent team this year. Their schedule just probably won't let them have as many wins as they might deserve to. Then they have a bye week before the Red River rivalry with Texas. This one's going to be at home for Oklahoma, but I don't know if it's going to make much of a difference. Quinn Ewers and the Longhorns have a very high potential this season and are most likely going to be a playoff team, which does not bode well for Oklahoma. The home game against South Carolina won't be quite as bad. I do think the Gamecocks will be good. However, Oklahoma at home should be able to get the win in that one. Road trip to Ole Miss will be more difficult, as will the road trip to Missouri. I think both of those are going to be very tough games against very good teams who we do have ranked higher than Oklahoma in our rank and file poll. I kind of skipped over that matchup against Maine because you really don't need to mention it, but I did for you just there. That'll be a 70-point Oklahoma win most likely. They get one more bye week before those very difficult last two games against Alabama at home and LSU on the road. Both of those are going to be difficult games to win for Oklahoma. They have a total of 8 home games and only 4 away games. However, with 6 opponents ranked in our rank and file top 25, Oklahoma has a schedule difficulty of 8 out of 10.
Looking here at the guaranteed wins for Oklahoma, we have Temple, Tulane, and Maine, all of which are relatively self explanatory. Tulane's a relatively respectable out of conference group of five program to be matched up against for Oklahoma. So we don't want to act like that's the same level of easy that we feel Temple and Maine are going to be. We think it's pretty much impossible, with all due respect to Temple and Maine, that they're able to pull off an upset against Oklahoma. And we do think that's the case with Tulane as well. But we want to stress that Tulane is definitely harder opponent than Temple or Maine, but they all ultimately fall into the same category at the end of the day. We don't see a scenario really at all in which any of these three teams are able to win the game against OU. So we have the Sooners winning all three of them. As for the likely wins for these Sooners, we have Houston, Auburn, and South Carolina. Starting off with Houston, we think Houston is a team that just simply does not have the roster to keep up with Oklahoma. This is a former Oklahoma conference foe, as they played in the Big 12 together for just one season before Oklahoma and Texas bolted for the SEC. We think it's going to be a pretty rough year for Oklahoma in their inaugural season in the conference, but we don't see that stooping to a level where they lose any out of conference games. Again, we did put Houston as a likely win for a reason. There's always a possibility that something crazy could happen, but we don't really see it with this one. As for Auburn and South Carolina, they both have one thing in common. They're rebuilding SEC programs. Maybe not rebuilding as much as, say, Arkansas or Mississippi State, but they're right in that tier above them. Uh, Lower tier SEC teams for this year for sure. Auburn's a program to keep an eye on for the near future because they've been recruiting pretty well, but we don't see them really posing a threat to too many upper tier SEC teams this year. As for South Carolina, they have a long rebuild ahead of them. Quarterback Spencer Rattler is now in the NFL, and even when he was on the team last year, they weren't all that successful. So optimism isn't too high in Columbia, South Carolina this year. So that's why we have the Gamecocks on the likely wins list. You never really know when it's an SEC opponent, so that's why we have a tiny possibility that we're leaving the door open for of a South Carolina upset. We don't really see that happening. Starting off the toss-ups for these Oklahoma Sooners in this video, we have the Tennessee Volunteers. This game is very intriguing because both teams are starting new quarterbacks, both of which are former five-star recruits, really highly regarded prospects coming out of high school. But we give the slight advantage to Oklahoma because they're playing this game in Norman, and especially when it's early in the season, it's very possible that a quarterback who's inexperienced in playing a road game in front of 80,000 people gets a little bit rattled, which I think plays in Oklahoma's favor. But either way, we think it's entirely possible that Tennessee wins this game, and we recommend that even if you're not a fan of either one of these programs, you definitely tune into this one just to see how it turns out, because we think that this game is going to go down to the wire and be one of the games of the year. As for Ole Miss, Mizzou, and Alabama, we think Oklahoma is going to lose all three of these games. If you look at Ole Miss and Alabama, they both are complete teams. But the reason we don't have them as likely losses per se is because we think that Brent Venables' defensive expertise is something you have to give him the benefit of the doubt on, especially with Oklahoma's caliber of talent. They have lots of talent on that roster. And if your defense is able to play well, your team is always in the game, so it's hard to totally count them out. As for Mizzou, we give them the advantage because we think that athletes like Luther Burden, who is very possibly the best receiver in football and very possibly could win the Biletnikoff Award this year, we think he is going to make a huge difference in this game. We don't think Oklahoma quite has the firepower this year to match up with Mizzou in a battle of SEC foes that we think is going to be one of the better games of this season. As for the likely losses for these Sooners, we start off with the Texas Longhorns. This is one that's going to sting for Oklahoma fans, but we do expect the Horns to beat the Sooners in Dallas when they play each other this season, just because we think Texas is the third best team in all of college football. Their defense is more than good enough to allow them to hang with the best of the best. Their quarterback, Quinn Ewers, is a Heisman hopeful, despite the fact that Texas lost two of their main receivers in Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell to the NFL. They still have weapons like Isaiah Bond, who transferred in from Alabama. So overall, we just think Texas is going to prove to be too much for OU this year, despite the fact that OU got the better of them last year. As for LSU, it's really hard for us to imagine Oklahoma winning in Death Valley. Death Valley to us is the most intimidating atmosphere in all of college football, especially when the game is at night. With an inexperienced quarterback like Jackson Arnold, although he is very talented, we just don't think that Oklahoma is going to be able to match up very well with LSU, especially an LSU team that's going to be much improved on defense. Harold Perkins is coming back. That dude is one of the best players in college football, and an uncharacteristic flaw of LSU last year was they didn't have a good defense. And especially with Brian Kelly's coaching philosophy, that's not going to fly for very long. So we're pretty confident the Tigers are going to be able to pull this one out.
Taking a look at the schedule recap, like I mentioned earlier, those first three games of the season really won't be very difficult for Oklahoma at all. But it does get a little bit trickier with Tennessee and the road trip to Auburn. I do think Oklahoma is able to win both of these games and head into the bye week and then the Red River rivalry matchup with Texas at 5-0. But I do think that's where the undefeated season ends. Texas is just too good, and I do believe that they win that game on the road. Oklahoma bounces back with a win against South Carolina, moving them to 6-1 and securing bowl eligibility. But in my opinion, this is the last Power 5 win they're going to be able to pull off in the year. The road trips to Ole Miss and Missouri are going to be probably close games. However, I just think both of those teams have a little bit too much in order for Oklahoma to lose, especially on the road. That really doesn't help. So I am going to pick Ole Miss and Missouri in both of those. And in between, they'll easily win that FCS matchup against Maine. Second bye week comes in before the home game against Alabama and the road trip to LSU. Both of these teams are ranked inside of our rank and file top 10. And even though Alabama is a home matchup for Oklahoma, I just really can't see the Sooners winning either of these games. So this puts Oklahoma at a predicted record of 7-5. Their projected record is sitting at 7.6 and 4.4. So there is a possibility that they win one of those three toss-ups, the Ole Miss, Missouri, and Alabama games. But I think they're going to end up finishing 7-5. Now, if Oklahoma has a much better season than we think, maybe they win all of those and they can finish up to like 10-2 or so. I just don't really see that happening. First year in the SEC, I think it's going to be a difficult one. Maybe next year will be better, but the back half of the schedule just really wasn't favorable for Oklahoma. FPI has them at 8.2 and 3.9. I do think there's a pretty good potential that they could finish with only 4 losses and get one of those wins. Just the fact that 3 of them are on the road and 2 of them are against top 5 teams makes it super difficult to do that. They have a 36.6% chance to make the playoffs and a 2.8% chance to win the national championship. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future videos, and we'll see you tomorrow.